been very concerned lately about China. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
We are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
yes, that's true. Right.
So suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people?
Yes, yes, I do. They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
And because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because it happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure. We would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because it's soft power. Because because they knew that if oil is discovered, and it was discovered later, then, of course, the Ethiopian government will be much more open to Chinese oil companies coming there. They have never combined their investment with imperialistic. Can you imagine if that was a German company or an American company? That's why I'm saying I don't think you should worry.
Okay, I won't.
Africa is the battlefield, but this time Africa refuses to be the victim. Welcome to Neo Africa, where Africa tells its own story. Thank you so much for your love and your comments. Now, let's talk about the new Cold War happening right on African soil. A war where Africa is no longer silent, where Africa is no longer passive, and where Africa is no longer manipulated without understanding. This is China versus US in Africa. And trust me, this is deeper than investment. It is deeper than just loans. This is a war of global control. And Africa is the center of gravity. Because whoever wins Africa wins the world. But Africa is not just sitting there. Let's talk about that.
China, Russia, we're going to work with them on our own terms. The Chinese don't go around Africa stealing anything from Africans. Your corrupt leaders overcompensate in exchange for something personal. That's what happens. The Chinese don't steal anything. One, they are in business. When the more you give them, the better for them. Why must they say no? Your leaders are not negotiating in good faith. They are negotiating with their families in mind. That's why they overcompensate. So we have no such a relationship with China. We've got a socialist and developmental relationship with China, and we know that China will help us. Russia, is not our friend ideological. We are with Russia in its fight against Ukraine because we know it's a NATO fight. It's not a Ukraine fight. So that NATO can expand its territory and be closer to Russia and undermine Russia. For that, we'll be with Russia because we can't allow territorial expansion of imperialism and colonialism in whatever direction. But Putin is not left. The government of Russia is not left ideological. If anything, Putin will be more aligned with the US in terms of policy and ideology, except their fundamental differences on imperialism, where Russia feels that America wants to control it through expanding the military base of NATO, because the military base of NATO is an American military base. So we are with Russia in that context.
For a long time, the world saw Africa as the place you come, you take, exploit, and leave behind in property or in poverty. Okay, but today the world has changed. China rose, America panicked, Europe is confused, Russia is re-entering. When you look at India, it is chasing opportunities. Turkey, it is making moves, you know. And Africa, the youngest continent with the largest untapped market, is no longer a side story. Africa is the new global prize. Why? Because whoever wins Africa, as I said, whoever wins Africa wins resources, wins market, strategic positioning, military reach, future population, and global influence. And both China and America knows that. And that is why a new gold war is unfolding in Africa quietly, strategically, and aggressively. But here's the twist. Africa is no longer playing checkers right now. Africa is learning to play chess. Okay? Now, before we just understand the new Gold War or Cold War, because we have Gold War and the Cold War, and this Cold War is all about the gold. Okay? Let's rewind a little bit. The original Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union treated Africa like a chessboard. Countries weren't supported because of development. They were supported because of ideology and who aligned with the West or the East. Example, back then, the USA backed dictators who supported capitalism. The USSR, they backed liberation movement that opposed Western influence. Angola became a battlefield between America-backed forces and Soviet-backed forces. Congo's Patrice Lumumba was removed because the West didn't want Africa leaning east. Okay? On the other hand, South Africa became a pawn during apartheid because the West saw the apartheid regime as an anti-communist ally. And the result was Africa did not win, the West didn't bring development, the East collapsed, and Africa was left with instability.
China is a very interesting country from which there's a lot of things to learn. But she's also a danger to the continent if we are not careful. I was watching the CGTN and I was listening to the 6,000 delegates in China sitting and thinking about China, how China will deal with Africa and the world 100 years from then.
Now, today, the Cold War restarted again, but this time the players changed. China enters the game and he's the new player who read the room. China didn't come with guns or coups or we'll save Africa, but China came with money, infrastructure, roads, railway, ports, diplomacy, and no lectures about democracy. So China's message was clear here. We want business, no moral drama, no colonial guilty, let's build. So the message hit Africa differently Because for decades, the only thing the West brought was aid tied with conditions, military bases, exploitive contracts, neo-colonial pressure, lectures about governance, but China changed that. Now the Belt and Road Initiative brought massive projects. We saw standard gauge railway in Kenya, roads and ports across East Africa. We have seen dams and power plants in Ethiopia, mining and industrial zones in Zambia. We see rail networks in Nigeria, smart cities in Egypt, telecommunication with Huawei across the continent. So China became Africa #1 trading partner, surpassing the USA and Europe combined. But here is the most thing that people don't see. China's plan is long-term. They are not looking at Africa as charity, but they are looking at Africa as future global engine. And America panics because they are losing Africa. When America realized that China was becoming Africa's favorite partner, Washington panicked. Suddenly the US started sending more and more diplomats to Africa. USA restarting military partnership, launching new counter-China strategies, pushing AGA renewal, But the problem is, another approach is still stuck in the old mindset. Instead of offering development, America offers lectures about democracy, security partnership, military bases, warnings about Chinese debt. So Africa is asking, you had 60 years to build roads. Why are you panicking now? Or why are you saying this now? And the US is realizing that it is late to the game. But instead of rethinking their strategy, they are trying to block China instead of empowering Africa. That tells us why. That tells us the West has never had their interest. The West has never wanted Africa to be economically fit. Now, Africa has 30% of the world's mineral. That's including cobalt, gold, lithium, oil, copper, and rare earths in Tanzania. And whoever controls African minerals controls the future of technology. Now, Africa will have 2.5 billion people by 2050, and this is a young population, a massive market, an unlimited workforce. So China knows that. China knows that, America knows that, and Europe fears that. And Africa is becoming political bold because coups in West Africa, ECOWAS rejecting Western pressure, countries expelling France troops like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, forming the alliance of the Sahel state. This scares the West, but China sees it as an opportunity.
Africa need to use your own brain power to make up your own judgment. In the world of today, you hear a lot of talks about whether, Africa should be forced to make a choice between China versus the United States. I think that's the wrong choice. The real choice for Africa, as well as for the rest of mankind, is whether the United States is doing the right thing or is doing the wrong thing, or whether China is doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing. If the United States is doing the right thing, work with the United States. But if the United States is doing the wrong thing, why should you bother about working with the United States or following its leadership? Similarly, if China is doing the right thing, why don't you want to work with China? And, God forbid, if China is doing the wrong thing, why should you work with China? That means African countries, people in Africa, need to use their own brain power to make a decision first, whether this country or that country is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Don't be forced by any other country to make a choice which will not serve your fundamental interest.
Africa geographical strategy is on a good spot. Control Africa, control trade routes. The Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Guinea, the Sahara Corridor, the Mediterranean Gateway. Again, Africa is redefining global influence. Okay? BRICS expansion, African Union joining G20, Pan-African discussions, leaders rejecting Western narrative. So Africa is no longer an observer, Africa is becoming a driver. Okay? Now, China's strategy in Africa was awesome because China didn't just show up randomly. They came with calculation. And here's how, or the three steps, or the three strategies that China uses. Number one was infrastructure dominance. China built rails, roads, ports, power plants, industrial zone. And who build your infrastructure controls your economy map. Number two, resources security. China secured critical minerals for its industries. EV batteries, solar energy, smartphones, computers, cars, military tech. So China invests in Africa, mining at huge scale. They have invested in African mining. Step number three, market expansion. Africa becomes a buyer of Chinese products, a location of Chinese companies, a partner in global trade routes, and a future economic ally in BRICS. So China knows Africa will be the next economic giant, and they want to grow with Africa, not against Africa. That is the thing that China did. And that's the thing that the West did not do, America did not do for years. And I think they are regretting that. Because the American strategy was about power of military and influence. Unlike China, the US strategy relies on AFRICOM, counterterrorism training, political influence, dollar-based trade, funding NGOs, supporting civil society groups, media influence, and sanctions. So the US sees Africa more as a security problem than an economic partners. And that's why the US strategies or struggles to compete with China infrastructure-driven approach. Because Africa don't want lectures, Africa want development. Okay? Now, one of the sharpest weapons in the new Cold War is narrative control. See, the USA controls Hollywood, global media, social media companies, think tanks. But so the US used its soft power to paint China as a debt-trapped power, a neo-colonizer, a threat to democracy. So, and it paints itself as a protector, partner in freedom, and defender of human rights. But here's the truth. The West never minded authoritarianism in Africa, as long as it served Western interest. And China is simply a new competitor, and the West is not used to competition in Africa. So meanwhile, China's narrative is different. Respect sovereignty, don't interfere with domestic politics, we have equal partners, bring the development, not bombs. And when this is fully returned, when this is fully true or not, the perception shapes reality. PLO Lumumba puts it best. He says that Africa must recognize that not foreign powers or no foreign powers comes out of clarity. They come because Africa is valuable, but Africa must learn to negotiate from a position of strength. And that is the key.
China is a very interesting country from which there's a lot of things to learn. But she's also a danger to the continent if we are not careful. What is there to learn from China? The thing to learn from China is that during our lifetime, the Chinese, through their ingenuity, have succeeded in lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty. What did the Chinese do? Is there something that we can learn from them? I think there is. Those of you who have the advantage and the privilege of serving in government, ask yourself, what did the Chinese do that within our own lifetime they succeeded in doing that? And they are everywhere, the Chinese. They know what they want. I think the first thing that you must do, you must know what you want. You know, last year I was sitting and watching a Chinese news channel, and if you want to understand what others who are potentially your friends and enemies are doing, you must listen to their news. I was watching the CGTN, and I was listening to the 6,000 delegates in China sitting and thinking about China, how China will deal with Africa and the world 100 years from thence. The people who are there will not be alive. In many African countries, if you tell them to think about what will happen tomorrow, they say only God knows. No. I hold the view that when you are planning, you plan as if you will never die. And if you are prayerful, you pray as if you'll die the next minute. I'm suggesting that the Chinese have given us away. Today, the Chinese, and see how the Chinese are working with us. Which university in Africa worth its name does not have a Confucius Center? I do not know whether you have one here at UCC. Why do the Chinese have a Confucius Center? Because the mind is the standard of the man. Once you influence the mind, you can sit pretty because you can predict what the mind will do. How many of you who are the middle class today, in addition to asking your children to read French and German, are now asking and encouraging their children, go ye and learn Mandarin? How many of you? Confucius Center to work on your mind. On our mind. And then, how many countries in Africa don't you find a stadium built by Chinese? And if it is not a stadium, it is your state house. And if it is not the state house, it's the African headquarters. And if it is not the African headquarters, it's infrastructure, is the road or the railway. And if it is not the railway, it is 4 lorries. And if it is not those, in the next 10 years, out of every 10 phones used by you will be Chinese. If it is not Techno, it is Infinix. If it is not Infinix, it's Huawei. No African country produces a phone, none. It's only Rwanda that is beginning to assemble some. There is something to admire about the Chinese. But if we want to benefit from the Chinese, we must be strong. We must be weak. We must not be weak. We must negotiate continentally. The Koreans are also small but strong. But if we are not careful, and I'm saying this, if we are not careful, in the next 25 years, all of us will be speaking Mandarin. If we are not careful. If we are not careful. Because the Chinese here are not here for charity. The Chinese are here to do business. And in the world of business, it is a cruel world where throats are literally cut. I'm reading a small book written by a young Chinese girl called Irene Yuan-sun, The Next Factory of the World. And the young Chinese girl is saying exactly what I'm saying. He says that Africa can benefit from China. Africa can be the next factory of the world. But it's not just going to happen. Something must be done about it. Which is what brings me to the last segment of my conversation, Africa Agenda 2063. I remember on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Nkosazana and Lamini Zuma, the then chairman of the Organization of the African Union, writing and reading an imaginary letter to Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. I will not remember the words exactly, but I'll remember it in substance. And in substance, he was saying, by the year 2063, we Africans, having recognized that we may have lost the last 50 years of our independence, will not lose the next 50 years of our independence. I'm adding a few things in order to make it relevant. But she was saying, in effect, the Osagyefo, in the year 2063, Africa will be different. There'll be an electric rail running from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to Dakar in Senegal. In the year 2063, Africa will be feeding herself, and the bread basket of Africa will be Zimbabwe in Southern Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will be making her own furniture, and we will do so in a sustainable manner, with the equatorial forests of Congo being the source of our products. I will remember in those years to come, what you now see as the Sahara Desert will have been greened. Africa will be covered in forests. The Democratic Republic of Congo will become the equivalent of the Silicon Valley. There will be rare earth. Africa will use funds made by Africans. Africa will refine their own oil. Africa will use our own copper. Africa will have excess electricity. Africa will have the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will have built the Grand Renaissance Dam. And indeed, at that time, Sudan will not quarrel with Ethiopia, and Egypt will not quarrel with Ethiopia. They will be using these resources well. Africa will not be importing fish, tilapia, from China. The fish will be produced in Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Tana, and all these other places. That was the reason of Africa Agenda 2063. It was a dream. But is it not true that we must all dream? We must dream. The only thing that we must do once we have dreamt, we must wake up. The problem is sometimes we dream and we don't wake up. We must wake up and now begin to implement. Do I think that Africa woke up? I think Africa woke up. And that is how I understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a demonstration that beyond dreaming in a very amorphous manner, we now want to give form and character to our dream by operationalization, so that we begin to bring down the tariff and non-tariff barriers, so that we are able to ensure that Africa will do things that will make Africa great. Intra-African trade will be 80%. And that is why it gladdens my heart that Accra, Ghana was chosen to be the secretariat of the ACTF. I look forward to the day when the protocols are now being made, that we shall begin to take advantage of innovation. You remember Africa lost out in the first industrial revolution. Africa lost out in the second industrial revolution. Africa has started gaining a little from the third industrial revolution. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution, where we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about robotics, we are talking about the Internet of Things. We are saying that Africa must now find her pride of place in those areas, so that Africa can be great in agriculture, Africa can be great in education, Africa can be great in value addition, Africa can be great in utilizing our fossil fuels, so that young Africans will not cross the Mediterranean Sea. When I look at Africa, I think that she can be made to work. But the last thing that we must do is to ensure that we introduce hygiene in our politics. Because it all begins and ends with leadership. History has demonstrated, not once, not twice, but times without number, that when you have men and women who are good leaders and they know what they want, they can catapult their countries within a short time into the higher orbits of development. We must now begin to ask ourselves, how do we govern ourselves? How do we create a political environment where all these things can happen? I'm suggesting to us, without being arrogant, and speaking hopefully with the humility that will not sharpen the anger of leaders in this forum, but will open their eyes. When you are in a position of honor and privilege, remember that your duty is to serve. Those of you who are cabinet ministers, remember that you are not necessarily the best of men, but you've been favored to be in positions of honor and privilege. You are not necessarily the best of women. Because you have been honored and privileged, serve in humility. And the problem in Africa is that many African leaders suffer from what I call the Jehovah complex. The Jehovah complex is a belief by those in leadership that they have the monopoly of wisdom and they have the monopoly of knowledge. That is not the route. Africa will be great when her leaders begin to know that they have a duty to serve so that the future generation will be able to make Africa great again. Africa can be great. Africa will be great. Africa will be great in agriculture. Africa will be great in our industries. Africa will be great in our education. Africa will be great in all other things. But the last thing that Africans must do is to decolonize our minds. We must liberate ourselves from this misguided view that we cannot achieve. We can achieve, we have achieved, and going forward, working together, we will achieve. God bless.
This Cold War is not about who loves Africa, but it's about who benefit from Africa. The question is, will Africa benefit for herself? And that's why we need the youth to wake up. We need the youth to wake up. African leaders who are playing smart or playing foolish, we want to know that. Because leaders who think Africa is a playground, they bend whichever power offer them money or political protection, and they allow unfair contracts, they allow military bases. We don't need leaders like those. We need leaders who play smart, who know to negotiate. The new scramble for Africa in 21st century version, it is here. It is here. They are competing for influence, competing for resources, for political alliances, military access, and digital dominance. It's no longer just Europe that is competing, but you have seen China, America, Russia, Turkey, India, UAE, Iran, they are all here. So we need to play smart. As youths, we need to wake up and take leadership because we have what it takes to lead. Tell me what you think on the comment section. Until next episode, peace out.